to the Cinematologists podcast. I'm Neil Fox, and joining me as always is Dario Linares. Hello, Dario.
Hello, Neil. Great to see you and talk to you again. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Yeah, it's a busy time down Falmouth with the grades and the final bits of marking all going through. But so it's been a busy week of collecting all the information from different markers and second marking and stuff. But I like that week, where you start to see the shape of the cohort and sort of you really get a sense of the achievement of the students. And it's been a busy week, but a fun week. What about you?
I'm good. I'm trying very consciously not to shout this week because as before we came on, we were just having issues with mics, which is a theme, I think, of today's show if we consider what comes up later on. But we'll talk about that later. But yeah, no, I'm good. There's actually a little bit of a break for us before the next round of marking comes in, and I've got 2 pieces of work to submit to articles, both on podcasting, that are due for the end of the month, and I'm just really trying desperately to get them off the desk. And then, because I think June is just going to be a lot of marking and admin, but it's good because I'm doing work that's almost sort of taking me back to my sort of PhD process, really, in terms of reading a lot of stuff and then trying to synthesize it into an argument. And some of it's quite new, actually, so it's interesting then trying to think through new theoretical material in the light of podcasting, which it wouldn't ordinarily fit towards. Obviously, the work I'm doing is on the philosophy of technology, and there isn't really anything written about that as pertaining to podcasting directly. So it's interesting stuff, really. Yeah,
it sounds it. I look forward to reading that when it lands, hopefully later on this year, I guess.
Hope so. We'll see, because deadlines are all kind of a bit up in the air, aren't they? But yeah. It's a funny one now. I think hopefully publications and stuff are giving academics a little bit of leeway. I know on Twitter there's been a lot of discussion around female academics. Their submissions have plummeted and male academics haven't. So there's clearly a kind of gender-based stratification of whatever the reasons are. We can all guess that it's to do with housekeeping and teaching kids and the way that those kinds of roles have gone into sort of maybe gender stereotypical positions, and that's affecting female academics. And I've heard some really terrible stories about that. But you would hope that academic publishers will be quite forgiving in that sense.
Hope so, yeah. It is interesting. Beth and I were talking about that, and because I've been very productive in this lockdown, which is nice, but not at the expense of my wife, who's also been very, very busy working and doing lots of different things. But for me, it was just having the extra childcare responsibility and house stuff has meant that the online work during the day in terms of work hours is what's actually had to be scrapped, because just haven't been able to sit in front of my computer for 7 hours as I'm sure my institution would like me to do, kind of being on, because there's been other responsibilities. But despite that, there's still been much more headspace to think and write and do things, and no travelling. And what we were saying this morning is, what's interesting is there's no losing an hour a day just from being stopped by people, going between rooms, grabbing an extra coffee, sort of being asked a question every 5 minutes. It's much easier to demarcate time and sort of do things. It's been a really interesting period of reflection in that sense. But I know from the work that Beth's been doing in terms of her kind of Association of Death Studies group, that it really has hit female academics negatively, just because, like you say, there's child caring responsibilities. A lot of it is caring responsibilities as well, either in the house or kind of staying in contact with people who are not in the house, but can't be visited, and those kind of things. Which naturally falls on women more in the main. So yeah, let's hope that like all the other institutions and kind of organisations, academic publishers are heeding the realities of the time kind of responding accordingly.
Yeah, I mean, we can but hope. I mean, I know it isn't happening in some cases, so we've got to be realistic about that, and hopefully there's some pushback happening in that way. But yeah, so this is our episode 101, and we've got a really good one today. Great interview coming up, haven't we, Neil? Which you sorted out.
Yeah, very pleased to have Mark Cousins back on the podcast. He was last with us for I Am Belfast, and he's back to talk about his new 14-hour documentary Women Make Film, which is an astonishing achievement any way you look at it, really. And we spent sort of about an hour last week, the three of us, you, me and Mark, talking about it. And it was a really great conversation, because it's always a great conversation with Mark Cousins. It's just a pleasure to hear him talk about film and his filmmaking process and his approach and his kind of thoughts on cinema. And we were very lucky that we were all on the call and got to spend some time together, which was really nice.
Yeah, it's one of the sort of advantages I think that we can now take advantage of, as it were, that of being in lockdown, that, you know, remotely we can be all on calls if we want to be, in terms of interviews. So it's just nice to have that little bit of backward and forward among the three of us, and maybe we'll have a chat later on about what that sounded like. You know what I mean, or what it sounds like. Although I haven't heard the edit, because you're going to do that. You're going to do that coming up. But yeah, it's just a great, fantastic piece of in-depth work, as Mark Cousins is known for. And I've got through only the first 3.5. I mean, have you done the whole thing now?
Yeah, I did the whole thing. Yeah, it's. And we allude to this, and you sort of ask him about it. It's a very impressionistic piece, in the sense of it's a vast thought exercise, and he's really interesting about how he would like it to be watched, which we kind of get into. But yeah, there's so many kind of memorable images from films that I know and don't know that kind of keep coming back, and the way it kind of ends, the last three chapters, the way it kind of rounds off the work is really, really thoughtful. And yeah, it rewards the investment, and I think it's going to be a really valuable piece of work for educators as much as anything else.
Yeah, we do talk about that idea of how to watch something that's 14 hours long, and I think I'm going to try to sort of maybe break it down in sort of segments in a specific kind of way, maybe an hour, once every 2 or 3 nights or something like that, but just keep on it. So I'm going through it in that sense. But yeah, it was just great. It was great to talk to him, and as we say in the interview, it's a sort of his work in broadcasting has been a bit of a touchstone for the podcast. So it's great that he comes on and talks to us.
Yeah, very, 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 very honoured to have him on.
So we've also got some films that we're going to talk about just beforehand, and you have been sent one of your usual batches of films from the BFI, have you not?
Yeah, BFI and also Eureka, Masters of Cinema, sent me a couple as well. So
right.
I'll deal with those ones first. They sent me the Sergio Corbucci spaghetti western, The Specialists, from the late 60s, with Johnny Hallyday, the French musician, in the lead. And it was a film that I knew about from years ago when I did Spaghetti Cinema, the kind of Spaghetti Western Film Festival and Conference at the University of Bedfordshire. And it was a film that we tried to get to screen for the Spaghetti Western event, which was the first one we did. But we couldn't get the rights to this that time around. So we went, I think, instead with The Great Silence, which is Corbucci's famous spaghetti western from that era, with Klaus Kinski, and famously homaged / ripped off by Tarantino in The Hateful Eight. Wonderful film, The Great Silence. And this was sort of the year after. And it's High Plains Drifter, essentially.
Right.
And there's a really interesting interview with Austin Fisher, who I did Spaghetti Cinema with, who's a kind of leading authority on spaghetti westerns, talking about how when the film was released, this is on the new Blu-ray, it was kind of dismissed by British critics because it was derivative, and had been seen it all before. And what he talks about is the specific conditions of production at the time in Italian cinema, which is basically that's exactly the point. that they took a formula that worked, and in this case it's the guy comes into town for revenge and plays two sides off against each other. Fistful of Dollars, High Plains Drifter, kind of all those touchstones. And that's what they did. It was a business model of, okay, this works. Let's do it as many times as we can before it runs dry. And the film made a lot of money in Italy. And that was the approach. And it was interesting to kind of hear him talk about when you don't kind of take into account the fact that the production context is that it is derivative and feels like a lot of other films, then you're kind of missing the point, in terms of what the film's trying to do. And it's interesting kind of piece, but then also made me think again, that when we talked about this on the 100th episode, that film is not static, that it is important to reconsider and go back and think about those things. And it's a hugely enjoyable movie. It's really funny, quite slapstick in places. Johnny Halliday's a strange presence. You know where the story's going because you've seen it before, but there's a comfort in that, and the film kind of revels in that and is just kind of luxuriating in the kind of the sex and the violence and the humour for entertainment's sake. But Corbucci's a good filmmaker, so it looks great, and there's lots of fun to be had. Well worth checking out, and the 4K restoration is stunning, and there's an Alex Cox commentary on it as well.
Oh, great.
So if another authority on spaghetti westerns, and I only listened to a bit just to kind of hear his voice talking about it. Well worth checking out. The other one I got sent was Johnnie To's Throwdown, which is a judo movie.
Okay. As opposed to a karate movie.
It's very important that it's judo. Yeah, very different. And a big part of the storyline. And he's a Hong Kong filmmaker that I've seen bits of. He's hugely prolific. Okay. But again, just the chance to see something a bit different. And it was fine. It was okay. I'm not a big... And it kind of... Watching it was interesting because I was like, it's like a fast version of Bloodsport or No Retreat, No Surrender. It's all built around judo fight scenes. One great judo kind of gang fight scene where loads of different criminals and kind of judo masters and stuff fight in this street outside a club. But they just do judo, and it's so odd, that there's this big fight scene where you'd expect knives and guns and, all bets are off, but it's kind of strict judo rules. It's very weird, but really good, and a kind of a nice story. But the reason I wanted to see it was because the title card at the end is Johnnie To's salute to Akira Kurosawa.
Okay,
it's kind of his tribute to Kurosawa, but it's a tribute to Kurosawa's urban movies. So Stray Dog, Bad Sleep Well, Drunken Angel, rather than the samurai movies. Right. So these kind of fringe characters in sort of low level crime, kind of just getting by settings in the city, which is kind of nice to sort of see an homage to Kurosawa that is not
Seven Samurai,
not Seven Samurai. So if you like judo and you want to kind of flash back to Eric Roberts in The Best of the Best or something like that, then it's well worth checking out. But not my
I thought you were going to say if you were going to flash back to Steven Seagal, and I was like, nah, I'll give that one a miss.
It's better than that.
Yeah, okay.
Because it's kind of it's I think if it's a curiosity in terms of just the martial arts, like how all the characters are very, very specifically judo fighters, and how much the judo creed is at the heart of it. An interesting movie.
It's funny how a lot of martial arts films, in the narrative, there is like an antagonism between different styles of martial arts, isn't there? It's a real sort of big thing in the narratives of these films. And
it is in this as well, like how he's adapted it and how he can be beat and how you can get the move to beat the move, it's very intricate and very important. The dojos and things like that. So it kind of reminds you a lot of the Bruce Lee movies as well, the different dojos kind of competing for primacy and stuff. A good movie for lockdown, definitely.
Right.
A good time passer. So we both got sent the other one, which was from the BFI,
Yes, so the film that we both got was Flavour of Green Tea Over Rice, which is an Ozu classic for sure. And to me, it gets to masterpiece level, although, you know, it's like half of his output is basically masterpieces. So it sort of defeats the object of the... I just thought this was great. I hadn't seen it before. It comes a little bit earlier, doesn't it, than his sort of what is generally recognised as his, you know, top period. If we're talking about, you know, Late Spring and Tokyo Story and all that stuff. But this is it's familiar stuff in terms of domestic drama and shifting social mores in post-war Japan. There's this wealthy middle-aged couple who kind of don't get along. They stay apart. The wife is kind of hanging out with her friends, and the husband is going to work. And it's all about how they're they're sort of tired of each other. And then there's this sort of parallel story of their niece who comes in and out of the story, who her mother is trying to marry her off to some guy she's never seen. So there's this whole sort of story about arranged marriage. But it's interesting because there's probably something written on the progression of Ozu's work and how it gets to be this sort of, you know, bittersweet mono-noir-y, you know, this contemplative type of style that comes from Japanese mythology and literature and all that kind of stuff. But this is, I felt that this was kind of a little bit westernized in a way. I wondered if he'd either, I don't know, himself sort of tried to be consciously riffing off some of the sort of styles and forms and even tone of American post-war sort of comedy in a way, sort of comedy of manners type stuff. Because it is funny in places, and you forget that about Ozu, you know what I mean? Because it's almost about this sort of contemplative and even sort of maybe quite depressing idea of domestic life, really. But the melodrama early on is definitely played, the marital strife in it is definitely played for laughs. And it's also interesting, I thought, more fluid in sort of the camera work than some of his later work. And, you know, you've got these exterior shots, and there's a shot on trains, there's a shot in the airport. There's this amazing scene, a velodrome. There's this cycle race that they go and watch, and there's quite a bit of, you know, footage of that sort of going round and round in circles, these cycles. But it becomes more like what you'd kind of call classic Ozu in the middle at the end, and there's this amazing scene around the dinner table where the couple kind of really talk to each other properly for the first time in the movie, and it's almost like that universal theme of how much do you know about the person that you're with, what they really think and what they really feel, and all you can see is that their way of behaving is not measuring up to what you want. And it really sort of comes together, I think, later on in the movie as a piece that you could recognise as fitting in with what Ozu's concerns are. But just beautifully done.
Yes, I concur. Yeah, absolutely loved it. I know what you mean in terms of the westernness. There was a real kind of quick fire patter, particularly to the women when they were together, which kind of a Lubitsch, kind of Preston Sturges kind of feel to it. The filmmaker it reminded me most of was Noah Baumbach. In terms
really?
Of,
wow.
Yeah, well, just in terms of like how modern it felt in terms of the preoccupations of kind of middle class married people and the ennui and the kind of the crankiness, the squabbles. You know, it was really interesting, and like you say, kind of felt much more kind of quick fire, but for Ozu, which was really, really interesting. And yeah, that the kind of the contemplative stuff feels like it's kind of in there being sort of formulated. Particularly, there's a scene where the husband goes away to Uruguay, and the wife, who's kind of left and not said where she's gone and kind of ignores his telegram to come back, comes back and has missed his flight, and he's kind of gone. And there's this really, really sad sequence of the house, the kind of the shots around the house where she's in it, and all these empty rooms, that feels very contemplative, and it's really sad. You just, because that's where you feel the rift in the marriage, really beautifully delivered. And then, like you say, there's that amazing sequence where they're kind of talking when he comes back over dinner, which is fantastic. And it was interesting because, as modern as it feels in terms of their arranged marriage, that they're a couple that were kind of put together, and then that is kind of married in the young niece's story as she's kind of getting put together. And then the overwhelming sort of message at the end is that marriage is reliability, and it's kind of comfort, and it's a kind of closeness of kind of unassuming proportions, which feels very conservative. But weirdly, watching it in the time, kind of feels like a kind of a plea for simplicity, and a plea for respect, and a plea for let's just kind of look at each other and get on the same page, which made it feel very pertinent to now. But yeah, just a beautiful movie. And I loved that they were talking in the it's one of those films where the idiocy of people saying, Tarantino's characters talk about the pleasures of pop culture, and this film opens, like you say, with a car ride where they're talking about the pleasures of Jean Marais, kind of Cocteau's actor from like Beauty and the Beast and Orphe. And I was like, it was so wonderful to just have these two women talking about movies, and going to the cinema on their own and stuff like that. And it's like, just a reminder of how he did make a lot of really, really great movies, but in every frame and in every scene of this, it's just, there's so much to enjoy. Like it's absolutely wonderful. Really, 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 really great movie. It
really whets the appetite for the BFI Japan season, does it not? I mean, great that that's coming up now.
Yeah, so this is one of the first releases to coincide with what was intended as a many-month kind of year-long cultural exchange as part of the Japanese Year of Culture to coincide with the Olympics. And a lot of that has been postponed or curtailed by the current situation, but the releases are still going ahead. And as in our role as kind of one of the partners of those national seasons, we were in talks with a lot of different organisations about doing some events, which we shall have to see. But it is exciting because it's a country whose cinematic riches are vast and so diverse. So it's exciting to be able to revisit those wares again.
And a real opportunity, I think, to sort of see some of the work by Kurosawa and Mitsuguchi, who's my favourite of the Japanese directors, and Ozu, some of the stuff that maybe you don't see first of all, and this was obviously nice because I hadn't seen that before. But also I'm really looking forward to seeing work by Kon Ichikawa and Mikio Naruse as well. Because I just don't know anything about them really at all. And it's it's one of the things we sort of talk about later on in this show with Mark, is that idea of just making yourself stop talking about the same films over and over again, or just that being the default setting. You know what I mean? What's the classical this? What's the classical that? And it's getting past the Kurosawa, Ozu, Misoguchi axis is one of my aims for this season.
A very worthy aim, and I support you in your quest. Yeah, absolutely looking forward to. It was one of those ones when I was at the development day for the BFI where they were, and I thought, we can talk about this, we can talk about this, and you just realise how many filmmakers across the ages have kind of come out of Japan. It's quite astonishing. And very exciting. One of the things I wanted to ask is, like, it's this idea of a national cinema is kind of, not necessarily one we support in terms of, the idea that there is a particular filmmaking that represents a country. But I wondered, if you kind of had an awareness about any countries where you're regularly drawn back to the cinema and the filmmakers that they offer. I imagine France is probably quite high on your list.
Yeah, I think probably France and Japan would be the two big ones, I think. I mean, the cinema of South America, very much so. I mean, I'm half Spanish, so I'm always got sort of one eye on Spanish cinema. But it's interesting with somebody like Almodovar. Is he he's not. I don't think he's really considered in a kind of framework of Spanish national cinema as much as other filmmakers are, because again, I don't want to say something like that because I might get bitten down by all the people who know more about this than I do. But I don't think he's particularly revered or loved in a in a fundamental way. Almodovar in Spain is what I'm saying. He's more of a kind of part of this international scene, really. But yeah, just sort of filmmakers of South America going all the way back to the third cinema development in the sort of 60s and 70s and that, because I learned a lot and read a lot about that in the way it was framed in opposition to kind of American and also art house cinema. So, first cinema being Hollywood, second cinema being European art house tradition. And the idea that neither of those can actually fulfill the potential of a political cinema to represent the identities of what you would call, third world countries. But obviously they want to call it third cinema because it's trying to use that term against itself in a way. So, those kinds of, that area of film, again, that's not a national cinema though, is it? So all of these terms are quite difficult, really.
Yeah, no, just curious, because like kind of, it did make me think, Japanese cinema is, but I don't want to sort of say like an expert, but what I mean is like that I'm interested when like on Mubi a film from Japan comes up, but I would say that particularly the last couple of years it's been Iran and Chile for me, when a kind of a festival or like I'm interested in those places in terms of their cinematic representations, and this sort of made me think about that.
Yeah, Iran's a big one for me as well, with Panahi and Kiarostami and everyone, and Mani Akbari as well, who Mark is a good friend of.
Indeed. Well, on that note, should we get into our chat with Mark about his work? So this is Dario and me and Mark Cousins talking about Women Make Film.
Most films have been directed by men. Most of the recognized so-called movie classics were directed by men. For 13 decades, and on all 6 filmmaking continents, thousands of women have been directing films too. Some of the best films. What movies did they make? What techniques did they use? What can we learn about cinema from them?
Form and content, violence and tenderness, love and loss.
We have seen the world.
Hundreds of great examples of cinema, 14 hours on the road.
The films we looked at have far more female protagonists.
Far more women at the center of the movies. Hooray for that.
Women make movies, great movies. They've done so since the birth of cinema.
They've helped define the anarchic, androgynous rectangle.
The movie screen.
There are surprises in what follows. Let's start at the beginning.
Thank you very much for joining us today on the Cinematologists, Mark. It's really lovely to talk to you.
Pleasure, thank you.
The Women Make Film project is it's a huge project, a really beautiful kind of tapestry of filmmaking. And in some of the kind of things that you've written, particularly for Sight and Sound, you sort of mentioned some of the filmmakers that kind of first got you into, well, not into women filmmakers, but kind of made you aware. I wonder if we could just start there with your kind of recollections of the first women filmmakers that you really kind of took a shine to.
Well, you know what's interesting? Before you become aware of stuff, you just see films and you like them. A lot of people, for example, saw and loved Wayne's World, and only years later did they realise it was directed by a woman. So probably I was just seeing and loving films. But for many people, the first time I became aware the first time it was marketed as a female director that I was aware of was Jane Campion. Or maybe Catherine Bigelow. And so the names that come up most when we talk about this stuff are Campion, Bigelow, Varda. They are the 3 that most people now seem to know. And so, yeah, that's where I first became aware in the sort of early 90s of the woman behind the camera.
Great. And in terms of the project itself, obviously, you're a guy who's got an encyclopedic knowledge of films, and famous for that. But how many films, were you actually seeing for the project, would you say, rather than film, the list of films that you probably had in your mind that you wanted to include?
Yeah, I mean, it was a matter, Dario, of plugging gaps. I'm very interested in what I don't know. I think my ignorance is my best friend in a way, so I could probably have talked about most of the French filmmakers and the Iranian filmmakers, but I hadn't seen any female Sri Lankan filmmakers, for example. I knew West Africa a bit, but I didn't know Latin America so well. And so it was almost like getting a big map, looking at the bits of the world where I didn't know about the female directors, and then informing myself. And I think it's not availability isn't the issue. It's about having the desire to look and assuming that it's out there. Yeah. I've got on my arm here, I've got a tattoo of Marie Curie, and she assumed that radium was out there. Nobody had found it yet. And that, I studied science, and so I think my background helped me to think, okay, what is out there that I haven't seen? What planets have we not discovered yet?
And there must have been almost a conscious awareness or need to sort of ditch all preconceptions about what should be in or out, because obviously the filmmakers and the films you're familiar with, you need to make room for the ones that you don't, as you've just sort of said.
Yeah, there are lots of preconceptions in the film world. Yeah. The sort of fanboy world is full of them, I would say. Particularly about high and low, high culture and low culture, art films and popular cinema. The number of times I've been asked, what is your guilty pleasure? And it comes from quite a sort of bourgeois perspective. There's official culture, and then there's the stuff that's fun but isn't so intellectually nourishing. I don't think I've ever really had that distinction. And there are other misconceptions or preconceptions, that from the right wing of the political spectrum, you have ideas about women, that women are homemakers, that they're good mothers, the archetypes of Madonna and prostitute, etc. And from the left wing, from the liberal perspective, we have other stereotypes or preconceptions, that women are empaths, that they are better at multitasking, and you have to ditch all that and look just with an open mind and think, actually watch thousands of films directed by women and look for the evidence. What type of films did they make? Is there such a thing as a female gaze? Are there certain subjects that dominate more than others? Are there certain genres that women are attracted to? And the overall answer is no.
Great. Yeah, definitely want to come back to some of that stuff as we go through. Were you surprised that at which films kind of recurred? I guess some that you were kind of expecting to come up quite a lot throughout the chapters, but were there any sort of surprises where you kept being drawn back to certain films that had so many things that you weren't necessarily aware of?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I'm very attracted to filmmakers who make almost good standalone scenes and good visual scenes, So the French filmmaker Lucille Hadzi-Lahilovich, for example, I've used Innocence and Evolution, a few of her films. She worked with Gaspar Noé, and he gets a lot of attention. I think he's very interesting, but her films are as daring. When I first started getting into this subject, Agnes Varda still wasn't enough in the conversation, and you could meet people. I remember people saying, I've never seen an Agnes Varda film. People who would be ashamed to admit that they hadn't seen a Scorsese film would happily say that. But that's changed in the last decade or so, and so she's in the conversation now, which is great. But there's a lot of Agnes Varda in this, but a filmmaker like from Japan, Kineo Tanaka, who was known as a great actor in the classic in Japanese films. But she recurs a lot because I think she was just a great technician. She was a great shaper of scenes. She was a great visual thinker.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to mention Kineo Tanaka because, I was wondering whether you think this film will continue the work of pointing out just how ideologically constructed the accepted film canon is. And it's interesting in the first section, quite early on, you sort of problematize the idea of the notion of using Lynchian or Hitchcockian as a term. And like it would be really easy to sort of compare Tanaka to Ozu, for example. But then later on you do use Godard and Hitchcock as markers. So is there a kind of, there's always a difficulty, isn't there, of the canonical lexicon creeping in and its patriarchal kind of dimensions?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's patriarchal to call somebody Lynchian,
right.
Because Lynch, the great, if you think about the language of cinema, he's got a distinct language of cinema. Sure. But yeah, you're right, Dario. I was reluctant to call people Wellesian or Lynchian, but because it seems a bit of a shame to compare them, these great filmmakers, to men, But let's admit it. We're talking about a common language of cinema that we all speak, and this film tries to be androgynous. It tries to have an androgynous gaze, and I think, and therefore I wasn't too troubled. And also I sort of think by any means necessary. If we can get people watching Kira Muratova films by comparing her to David Lynch, I think bring it on.
Great.
And then there comes a point, once these people are in the canon, once enough people in film culture have seen the great films of Kira Muratova, then the word Muratovan can become part of our everyday conversation, And so I think I'm quite pragmatic about that,
Sure.
Try to give, also, to be generous to the people who haven't seen the work of Muratova, and crucially, not to make people feel guilty that they haven't seen Kineo Tanaka films or Kira Muratova films or whatever, to help them, give them sort of a handrail, as it were, a way into these directors who they haven't heard of, because we all feel overwhelmed. There's so much out there. There's there's so many films to watch that it's okay to give a bit of a handrail at times.
Yeah. Neil,
you've referred to it in as a kind of film school, to be seen as a film school, and sort of written about how hope this stuff kind of is increasingly taught. What do you think the role of film schools are in addressing the kind of the disparities, and also the kind of the politics there, where we're just trying to get everyone on the same level in terms of people's understanding?
Can I be honest?
Yeah.
I wish film schools and film history courses were ahead of the curve, but I don't always feel that they are. I mean, lots of people, having watched women make film, came up to me and say, well, I spent a lot of money on a film degree and I wasn't taught about Binka Zhelyaskova. I wasn't taught about Malvina Ursiano. I was not taught about Janfisa Keiko, these unfamiliar names to most people. So I think film history courses in particular have some catching up to do. But that's okay, because the people teaching those courses didn't themselves necessarily get taught about these great filmmakers. So if we can all say we're all to blame a little bit, we're all at fault a little bit, we haven't been curious enough, we didn't catch up. People who were teaching in the 50s and 60s, for example, just couldn't see this stuff. But for more than a decade now, a lot of these films have been available on YouTube. So we all have to fess up and say, we've been behind the curve, but it's never too late, and we can rejig the curricula in our academies and rejig the list of films that are shown in our practical film courses. Yeah,
because I just remember thinking back to my degree, and when I was watching it, I was thinking in the sort of the late 90s, and I can't remember being taught female filmmakers in any context other than experimental film, which is almost like a kind of ghetto, where it's like, and it's really interesting.
And you raise an interesting point there, Neil. I know this is a bit of a sideline, but in terms of experimental film, I've encountered a lot the attitude that women make marginal cinema, i.e. experimental and aesthetically complex, like, take Chantal Akerman, for example. And yes, there are lots of women, Maya Deren, who have done that. But there's a difference between marginal and marginalized. And marginalized means pushed to one side. But aesthetically, in terms of the storytelling, the genres, a lot of these women were making quite mainstream films, and also very big box office films. Some of these people who we haven't heard of, like Binka Zhelyaskova or Edith Karlmar, they were ringing the box office bell again and again. So they were marginalised, but not marginal, I would say.
Did you think that this conversation that we're just having there, does that feed into the sort of how-to approach, the focus on the craft rather than, what is usually or often the go-to, what is this female filmmaker saying about women? Because it's clearly that was a conscious thing in terms of the process,
Yeah. I mean, I'm a filmmaker, and so I ask filmmaker-y type questions, I get pretty impatient with the generalizations, the kind of what sort of stories are women trying to tell, because women are trying to tell every type of story. I'm lucky enough to know a lot of the great female filmmakers of today, and they really don't want to be asked too much. Some of them, Chantal Akerman wanted to talk about her point of view as a woman looking at the world, but lots of, Lynn Ramsey doesn't particularly, and Sally Potter doesn't, I don't think, and there's an old TV program on YouTube where Sally Potter talks to Wendy Toy, two great British filmmakers, and they touch on this subject. When I was at university, there were courses on literature and then women's literature. And inevitably, I think that created a kind of two-tier strata, or a sense, a sort of visual, imaginative sense of mainstream and edge. And all of that is problematic for me, So
yeah.
I didn't really want to buy into that kind of categorization. I just wanted to be gender neutral. And when you think of the great voiceover artists that I got to work with on this film, Tilda Swinton, an icon of androgyny, Jane Fonda, Deborah Winger, sort of the boy girl, that kind of deep male type voice, Adjo Ando, Sharmila Tagore, who challenged gender stereotypes in India again and again. They had all the same attitude.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. It brings me onto this idea of voice, because, I mean, one of the great moments, there's so many great films and stuff, but then when the first voice shift happens, it moves from Tilda Swinton to Jane Fonda. It completely changes the tone of the film,
yes,
talking about
does.
tone. So I was just wondering, in terms of voice and in terms of the sort of script development and that kind of thing, and working with these great women, whose voice is it? Is it yours? Is there a sort of androgynous narrator you have in mind? That kind of thing?
Yeah, it's androgynous. I hate gender stereotypes. I wrote the script and then worked out with the women, who would like to do which part. I thought, I definitely want to give Jane Fonda a section on work. Because she's been brilliant on that. Kerry Fox, bodies, because she's been brilliant on that, etc. But hearing them perform in rather different ways. Kerry Fox is very big and loud and confident and Kiwi, and Tandy Newton, her voice goes so close to the microphone, she's almost whispering.
Yeah.
And Jane Fonda has got this confident voice, a voice of, several generations now, and that kind of multivocal thing really appealed. And also, it was clear, it was very important to me to show that this was a world story, a global story. We were not telling an Anglo-Atlanticist story. We were not telling a story about art cinema. We were really trying to look at what was happening around the world. And that's why it was very nice to get different voices from different places.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. And and just another one from me, because we're doing a podcast, it would behoove me, I have to ask you, how come there was no section on sound specifically?
Yes, I know. I mean, my hearing isn't great. So I've got a problem in my hearing. I don't hear all that well. So sound has I've never understood it as much. I've always been good at the image and less good at sound, Also, I mean, I have to say that the director doesn't control the sound necessarily as much. There's a whole team of people who do that, and often the film director doesn't have as much say on that. You could do a whole nother film on sound. You could do a whole nother film on screenwriting as well.
Yeah, no, that's interesting.
Keeping it on the focus of the directors there's a few kind of things that sort of jumped out watching it that I'd like to ask you about in terms of specific filmmakers. And the first one is Varda that you sort of mentioned there. she feels like a touchstone for the whole project, because her work crosses every form that you're talking about, experimental, documentary, narrative, short. Was that something that you kind of knew going in, or was it just something that just became obvious that she was going to recur so much?
I think for me, one of the central interest for me is innovation, who refreshes the language of cinema. And I think very few people of our times did so more than Agnès Varda. She did as much as her French colleagues who were more praised for doing the same thing, So that's why she's in there so much, the fact that when you look at tracking shots, she thought about tracking shots more than most of her colleagues. Her lovely phrase, ciné-écriture, cinema writing, so she was a natural, impulsive innovator, and that really appeals to me.
And obviously, it was the shift to video. She's kind of still not given enough credit for, discovering language of digital form as much as film form.
Yeah, I mean, there's a desire, there's a will to form in Varda, a desire to make, to keep making, which I just think is so life affirming. So she is a touchstone.
It was great to see lots of Antonia Bird in there. Is she a filmmaker who still hasn't had her due?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I was lucky enough to know Antonia, and I had a production company for a long time with Antonia Bird, and she was not given her due. She had the realist instincts of the British realist filmmakers, but she also was, I would say, Latin American in some ways. Antonia Bird's work was very highly regarded in Brazil, and I think for good reason. Those traditions in Latin American film culture around melodrama and the telenovela and in the expressivity, the heightened passionate emotion, Antonia had all that. Antonia was not a minimalist, and I think that's why she found it hard to get funding sometime, because the smart money in the film industry went to slow cinema and minimalism, and Antonia Bird was a maximalist. And that's, I think, why she was undervalued and continued to be undervalued.
One of the great kind of experiences of watching the film is kind of the learning. You talk about it in the video essay in terms of the people just kind of scribbling notes and and that kind of thing, but part of the thrill of it was kind of connecting with films that you are already, kind of in love with and close to. So, for an example, like Lourdes, the Jessica Hauser film, which I only watched recently, but was an absolute revelation. I just found it incredibly beautiful, and every time it popped up in the film, it just felt kind of good and warm that it was being kind of put on this stage and kind of discussed in this way. So I wondered if how you kind of think about the film, in terms of the experience, because we sort of want to talk a bit about that. Is it as much a kind of shared experience and a shared universe that you're hoping to create, as well as kind of bringing people to attention? If that makes any sense.
Yes, very much so. We're all in this together. And I don't see myself as a provider of information. I see myself as a seeker of information. So I'm sitting with everybody else, looking up at the screen, discovering these films, and that's the way I try to write as well. I never write the script in advance. It always comes as I watch the image. But to answer to refer to something that you imply also, Neil, yes, I wanted to mix the unfamiliar with the familiar, and so you like that film Lured, and so do I. But I wanted to drop in every now and again very familiar films, Tom Hanks and Big, or Wayne's World or something really major, just as a bit of reassurance or a kind of recognition, a smile on your face, thinking, yeah, I'm not totally lost here. And I think that's really pleasurable. It's like driving through the fog, and suddenly the fog clears for a moment and you see something. Oh, there's that hill that I recognize. And then you're back in the fog. Both are pleasure. The labyrinth is pleasurable, but then escaping from it is as well. So that's just the pleasure of storytelling. Also, I have to say, the editing. Let's say, for example, we edit together a film clip of Catherine Bigelow with a moment from a silent film by Alice Guy Blaché. Those kind of connections are fun when you can see that these two women working decades apart in very different genres were doing the same thing, having the same visual thought.
So yeah, I wanted to ask you a question that you're going to be asked, I think, probably by everyone, but try to figure out a way of doing it in a different way. And that is the idea of this project being shepherded by a man and the sort of politics of that. But, you know, is that a thing that has been in your mind or was in your mind and you were prepared for it? And you know, is it something that you really, you know, had to think about clearly about what your answer was going to be to that question?
Yes, every man who's interviewed me has asked that, and only a few of the women. And I mean, we knew that this would be an issue, something of an issue, the fact that I'm a man, and you know, I would rather this was made by a woman as well, you know, except that's patronizing, you know, because lots of women would be rubbish at making this because they don't have the knowledge or the filmmaking skills, you know. So again, we don't want to generalize. Here's my position, you know, I really started becoming interested in this subject around about the late 90s. And so it's been 2 decades now, and to be honest, you know, I'm so inspired by, you know, all the people who went before me, all the great feminist thinkers and curators, etc. But I felt as if I was waiting a long time for somebody to make something like this, and even a lot of the activists, you know, who were trying to change the film industry, were only talking about quite a narrow range of filmmakers. I felt, you know, and Kira Muratova was hardly mentioned, and it was the same small handful of filmmakers who were being talked about. And I became, over the years, increasingly frustrated at the narrowness of the discourse. And at one point I thought, okay, enough, I'm going to do it. What's the worst that can happen? You know, people can, you know, yell at me for being a man making a film about this. But as you know, having seen it, it is not about women. It is about cinema, very clearly about cinema. And I think that's what's liberating about it. And that's what's affirming about it. And the female filmmakers who have seen it, a lot of them have said, thank you for not talking about victimization. Thank you for not mentioning Harvey Weinstein. Thank you for not re-victimizing or re-marginalizing us. So there came a point where I thought it would be perverse and counterproductive not to apply my knowledge in some form, you know, and I'm sure there are people in the world who know more about this subject than me, but I'm certainly reasonably informed in this subject, and therefore I thought, why not? And I'm pleased to see, you know, I don't know if you've seen the review in The Guardian or Screen International, where they're taking these things on and sort of batting them away and maybe admitting, yeah, we approached this with some trepidation because it's a bloke who's directed it. But once you see it, I think you realise that the mistakes we did not fall into the potholes.
Does the road movie framework kind of lend itself to, you know, kind of really emphasizing the contemplation aspect of the film? You know, it feels very meditative. It feels very, you know, melancholy in places, but also that it has a freedom, you know, that kind of, but it all feels rooted in that idea of the road movie. So was that
yes.
something that you knew from the start, that you wanted to use those signifiers?
Yes, I knew. I always do this. I always have the same technique. I make a list of the conventional ways of doing something and strike out all those things off the list. So the conventional way to do this would be a chronology. So it's not a chronology. The conventional way would be to talk about the industry, and it's not about. I don't talk about the industry hardly at all. The conventional way would be to interview lots of people, and there isn't a single interview in it. So yes, I thought a road movie would be simple and elegant, have lots of driving shots between the film clips. This had a number of advantages. It was free almost, and we had no budget for this film at all, not a penny from any outside source. And so I had just been filming shots for years, and so we had all those, and we eventually bought in some more. A road movie would give a sense of traveling around the world. And this had to feel like a global story. And so we see mountains and rivers and deserts and cities, etc. And if that felt good. And also, after 14 hours, I wanted to arrive somewhere. I don't want to say in your podcast, if it's okay, where we arrive. But after 14 hours on the road, we arrive. The audience realizes all this time we've been traveling somewhere on a little pilgrimage, a micro pilgrimage, and we get somewhere which I think is significant to film history. You could say it's a source of the Nile, as it were.
Yeah, that's a lovely moment, and it reminded me very much of Patti Smith and her idea of proximity. And you seem someone who's really interested in the proximity and the physical, in being close to the sources of these things rather than just at a distance.
Yeah, it's being brought up Catholic. You're taught the idea of the pilgrimage and the place to go and worship. And lots of cultures get that in Mexico and China. And it's interesting. This film has sold more than anything I've ever done. Told China and Russia and India and all over the world. Actually, one of the few countries where it hasn't sold on TV is the United Kingdom.
That's really interesting. I actually wanted to pick up on that. I mean, do you think that this would have kind of found a place almost back in the day, the days when you were doing sort of movie drone? Would it have more of a likelihood of being screened, on BBC Two late night or Channel 4? And isn't that ironic, considering this, all of the space online that there is to put stuff, and everything all the so-called availability of everything we've got?
Yes, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, we're hoping that one of the UK TV stations will buy it, and BBC have seen some of it, and fingers crossed. But yeah, it is ironic that in a time with so much bandwidth and so much availability and so many digital channels, that so far no BBC broadcaster has committed to this. And we're not asking a lot of money. We're asking really very little money for a large piece of work. I think it's something to do with the fact that a lot of these women are unknown. They're not familiar names. And a lot of arts coverage and cultural coverage in the UK is about people we've already heard of, or people with strong connections to the UK. I don't know if that's because of a Brexity moment or something. I don't know. But this is a very global story, and there's a bit of United Kingdom in it. There are British filmmakers in there, but not loads. That's fine. I think 12. We've got very, very good British filmmakers. But, because I'm just thrilled that this film is already having a big impact. It played as a single 14-hour event on Spanish TV. Wow. It played in cinemas in Spain. It's had a big rollout in lockdown in Brazil. In Finland, they bought scores of films to play with it. So even if in the UK it doesn't have as big an impact, as a citizen of the planet, I'm just pleased that a lot of people around the world are interested in this.
Yeah, and it's at times impressionistic. The sort of the ideas flow constantly, so it's hard to keep it all in or have an overall shape. So it's interesting. Is there an idealized experience of watching for you in terms of people dropping in or dropping out or doing an hour at a time? I mean, there was a big furore over, The Irishman, that people couldn't sit down for 3 hours of that. So how would you suggest would be the best way of watching?
Yeah. This is playing in some countries in cinemas. In cinemas, I think 2 hours at a time is pretty good. It can be played, hopefully some galleries in the future will play it, like Christian Marclay's The Clock or something, just in a gallery setting. But in cinema, no more than 2 hours at a time, because there's a lot of stuff, Yeah. At home, I think it's completely different. Home is a multiverse and doesn't require us to look at one screen constantly, So at home, people can watch it. It can be their daily coffee break for 40 days if they want, or they can binge, or they can watch it before they go to bed, or I think any way they want, and they can watch it out of sequence as well. I know that I try to make it in a certain way and give it a kind of tone, but then you just throw it out in the world like a frisbee and hope it doesn't come back at you, like a boomerang.
Yeah, and it was really interesting when you did include some TV in there, like I think that the moment where The Handmaid's Tale comes in is quite obvious, and was that again another decision that you sort of had to make? Is this film or TV? And just with that, you've got things like Top of the Lake, for example, wasn't in there, which again, for me, Top of the Lake would be more cinematic than The Handmaid's Tale, but that's a subjective thing.
No, I agree with that. I should have put Top of the Lake in there, and I didn't. There's quite a lot of Campion, so that's okay, But I absolutely adored Top of the Lake. Yeah, I did. It's about cinema. I love TV. I watch loads of TV. Unlike a lot of people who work in TV, I watch a lot of TV, but it's a different form for me. It's a different language. So the few bits of TV stuff that's in there were bits that struck me as particularly cinematic, I guess. But yeah, you're totally right about Top of the Lake.
Is it important to consider TV? And you've got Lynn Ramsey's The Swimmer in there. There's a lot of Margaret Tate's short work.
Yeah,
we've talked about this on the podcast before with So Mayer and Girish Shambu. Is if we're gonna use the canon as a tool in cinema, then when we think about women filmmakers particularly and filmmakers from different parts of the world, we have to get rid of the idea that cinema is a 90-minute, 2-hour feature film. That it is shorts, it is music videos, it is you've got Beyonce in there. It has to expand in order to be inclusive. Is that feels like something that was driving the project as well?
Yeah, it's just a language, it's like literature. When you study literature, you study poetry as well as plays, etc. And of course, also for the biggest film industry in the world, 90-minute is unusual. In Indian cinema, it's closer to 3 hours. And so, yeah, and I think there are about 50 short films in there, and there should be more. But 50 short films out of maybe, I can't remember, 800 film clips or something like that. But there should be more. Definitely wanted to mix that up. As there isn't enough animation in there, although, some of the great animators like Caroline Leaf in there. And
I love the way it's kind of in the different sections, the different themes. And the economy section for me seemed like one where the film really gets to the heart of what makes cinema. This kind of manipulation of time, the ability to collapse time so quickly, and it just feels effortless. And then that kind of reminded me that, kind of brings to the surface that all of cinema is here, and the politics of the film seem to be wrapped up in the content, which just shows up through its sheer abundance and diversity. The sexist notion that women's films are uncinematic, that they make a cinema that's not, like you say, a kind of mainstream or a kind of conventional cinema. And I loved the use of Joanna Hogg's cinema in the hell section and also in the tension section.
Yes,
bringing in associations where just kind of really collapsing these kind of sexist preconceived ideas. Oh, it's not this. There's such a warmth to the project in terms of the content that says, like you say, everything you need from cinema is here in this work, but without being overtly political. Not really a question, but yeah.
Yeah, I like the way you're picking up on this idea of preconceived notions, because deep down in the creative process is the desire to remove preconceived notions or vault them, jump over them into an unconceived place, and so whether you're trying to ignore categories of male and female, or ignore genre categories, or ignore the way the work of Joanna Hogg is usually seen, as a kind of critique of bourgeois life in Britain. If you see her as somebody who makes films about hell occasionally, for example, that's fun. Recategorize something and suddenly it has a different life. It speaks, it has a different tone. So I love doing that. The greatest pleasure is sitting right in this seat where I'm talking to you now and looking at a film clip, writing about it. And as I write, I think of another one from a very different bit of the movie spectrum and realize that if you put them close together, like two poles of a battery, a spark might fly.
Fantastic.
Do you think that film cultural discussion in general has moved too much towards questions of ideology rather than questions of aesthetics? And, is this film almost a sort of, I don't want to say it's an intentional sort of counterbalance to that, but because its focus is so much on the craft, and yes, women filmmakers, but the craft of women filmmakers. And, it's just nice to be able to settle into that and not think, who's made this film? Is it the right person to have made this film? I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
I haven't really thought this through, but I think in the arts world in general, we have a bit of a tendency to think of ourselves a lot, to ask identity questions. Who is this person? And one of the central tenets in the arts is self-expression. If you're going to be a great filmmaker, if you're going to be a great artist in any way, you have to look inside yourself, find your story, and get it out there in the world. What if that's not true? I personally think it's not true. I don't think the root of creativity is self-expression. if you jump to the world of science, for example, it's a really different question that lots of scientists ask. They don't ask questions about their inner lives. They ask themselves questions about the structure of the atom or the solar system. And I think we could learn from scientists. And if we did, then we in the arts would ask fewer questions about identity and selfhood and things like this. And at least for some of us, that's pleasurable to get outside ourselves. Now, I know, Dario, your question was somewhat different about ideology, but I think, what I find is the starting point for a lot of discussions is, who am I and what's my worldview? What does the world look like from where I'm sitting? But, it's really good to ask a really different question, the Copernican question: what if we're not the center of the world? And I think that's the basis that's the impulse to make women make film, and that's why it sort of is not crucial that it's made by a woman, I think, although as I said earlier, I would prefer that it was.
but what's interesting about the clips is that that idea of not being the center of the universe and the kind of questions that the films pose formally, but also in terms of their content, their themes are decentered from that, because almost women kind of know that they're not the center of the universe, that their interest, at least the way you've packaged the films, is in much broader, wider context, as well as the deeply, deeply personal. It feels like that that there is a searching kind of intent behind a lot of these films that's beyond just reflecting the personal experience, because like you say, that there seems to be a desire to go beyond the association of I'm a woman, and that's what that's the stories that I'm going to tell.
I think it's men who talk that way, to be honest. I think if you're a lot of the female filmmakers that I know, are asking questions about, how do I entertain? How do I create, work with time and space in my films? And they're not asking questions about, as a woman, how do I see things? Some people, I repeat that some filmmakers certainly did do that, and I love their work as well. But, it's a sort of outsider's question in a way, I think, so it just didn't, bother me so much. It's really practical, and also a question of affirmation, I think, a kind of joy in the language of cinema. So it's a creative question rather than a ideological one, I guess.
How are you dealing with the current situation, Mark? And what's your thoughts about sort of cinema going forward in the next few years? I mean, funnily enough, I know this wasn't intentional, but it's with all these hours, it's a great time to sit down and watch this thing in its entirety.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I spend a lot of my life sitting in this edit suite where I'm talking to you now, so that hasn't changed hugely for me. My partner works in the NHS, and so she's very plugged into it all, and my job is to put a plate of food on the table every night for her at the end of her long day. Overall, what I'm trying to do, as usual, is try to be as positive as possible about this and see it as an opportunity to read slightly wider than I would normally read, and watch things that I wouldn't normally have a chance to watch. I'm working harder, I think, than I have done in a long time, and I feel I'm sort of planting seeds for the future. I'm aware that there's so much tragedy and suffering around, and I feel I must say I've been sort of crying more than usual. I think just you get overwhelmed, but a huge sense of opportunity as well.
Trying to keep it on that kind of positive, forward-thinking note really is what next. You mentioned that a lot of the films that are in the documentary are kind of available on YouTube. But they're not kind of readily available in the form that they deserve to be. So I wondered, if there's a kind of hope that there is a kind of concerted effort to actually make these films available in the same way that that Criterion does, or Arrow, or whatever, so that we can see these films as intended.
Yeah, I think I know there's behind the scenes there's a lot happening, and I'm lucky enough to have been asked to discuss with a number of film institutes and film releasing organizations to try and get films restored, subtitled, and out there. And already, a number of us, including me, were involved in Albania, and we got some of the Albanian films of Janfisa Keiko restored, subtitled, and out there. And that's the aim. That's the final aim. And I think more and more that's going to happen for loads of reasons, and Women Make Film will be a shoulder to that wheel.
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing and beautiful project. It was an absolute pleasure to spend my marking breaks this week. That's how I watched it.
Oh, thank you so much, Neil.
And I just wanted to say as well, Mark, that Movie Drome and then the story of film has really been a touchstone for the podcast. You know, it's one of the things that we go to all the time. You wouldn't remember, we actually met years ago at Leeds Met. You came down there. I think I do have a memory of that, Dario. Yeah. Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you to say, because it's, one of the things about lockdown, it feels, the sort of work that I do, it's very, marginal in some way. You feel as if you're working on your own or with a small team. So it's very nice to hear about the impact.
Well, thank you for sharing the film, and thank you for spending the time with us this morning.
Pleasure. Take care.
You too.
Russian-Ukrainian director Kira Muratova again. A stagehand in a Ukrainian theatre backs into the dangling body of an actor who has hung himself. The tone could be tragic, but the stagehand's words are light-hearted.
Борис. Подонок. Повесился. Козёл.
Dismissive, unshocked. The glittery costume adds to the sense of the slight absurd. Then this shot, on its side. Then this remarkable crane up as the body slowly slumps. And the set decor and piano music adds unexpected beauty to the tragedy and irreverence, a complex tonal recipe.
So thanks once again to Mark. Always great for him to take the time out to speak to us, and just to reiterate what a great piece of work it is, and I'm just still looking forward to getting through the rest of it. I mean, obviously we've covered a lot of that in the interview, but I don't know, is there anything to add in terms of the recording and how it went down and some of the things that you've reflected on afterwards, Neil?
So a few bits really. Just kind of thanks to Jill Redding as well. I think it's Redding or Reading. Redding at the BFI, who helped facilitate the conversation with Mark and set it all up. Much appreciated. It was nice to do it with you and on video, kind of, where we could all sort of see each other. We sort of talked quite a lot in the build up about structuring it and how it's going to work, and kind of wondered whether it would feel like a cinematologist conversation, because obviously it's much easier when the two of us are in a room doing it with someone, even if the two of us are in a room and the person's not. So it was kind of curious to see how it would work, but really, really enjoyable. I thought it was easier to jump in than I thought it might be, and kind of add things and move things along, and respond to what Mark was saying, than I thought. It felt very relaxed, which I was surprised about. Even though it's quite fraught, because there were some technical issues in the build-up, which obviously not on the recording. But he was very relaxed and was happy to just kind of help make it work. And it was just a really relaxed conversation, which, with all of what we know about trying to do this stuff on Skype and Zoom and all these kind of stuff, it didn't feel any of that really. What about you?
No, the same in that regard. I mean, I was sort of panicking a little bit at the beginning when basically everything that we were trying was going wrong. And yeah, having just written a sort of article on these issues, it was just coming home to me, oh, this is gonna sound terrible. But thankfully, yeah, he played it like a pro and helped us out in terms of being able to tape at his end. So that was really good. And yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, because obviously the kind of one of the key questions that he was asked, or he's going to be asked a lot about this, pertains to us talking to him about it, as in having the three blokes talking about women in film. And I think that his rather sanguine's not the right word, but pragmatic approach to it was, I want to talk about these filmmakers, and that there should be no apology for wanting to talk about these filmmakers, and him being in the position that he is to get this film made and being passionate about it. That's great. And we were a little bit like, do we need to get a female voice in to sort of almost compare our discussion? And we're like, no, we've got to. I think we wanted to take a leaf out of his book, because I think it's, I know we're not there yet, don't get me wrong, but the ideal must be that we should be able to talk about any filmmaker, you know what I mean? Just talk about their filmmaking. And that's what he tries to do in this, or that's what he does in this film. And not have to always reference where the filmmaker is from, or what gender the filmmaker is, or what other identity the filmmaker represents. That must be the ideal. Now, I understand that, of course, we're not there yet, and there has to be conditions by which female filmmakers or filmmakers of colour are put to the forefront in specific contexts to be able to be talked about, because, that space hasn't historically been there. But I don't want to get to the situation where, we're so narrow in our sense of who can talk about what. I think that that's only going to cause more and more problems sort of culturally down the line, if I can sort of put it in those terms.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think that, we're 100 episodes in. I think we are quite confident now in terms of how our audience knows how we approach these kinds of conversations, and when when it's important to talk about context and politics and that kind of thing, when it, and I think that there was a moment when he was like, the only time I've been asked about, the fact that I'm a man is kind of by men. But I think it was important that we asked it, because I think there's an expectation from our audience about how we engage with this stuff. I don't think necessarily our audience would want us to just bring in a woman to feel more comfortable to do it, but also that I think it's important that we acknowledge that we know that that's a question our audience might want, or part of our audience might want to hear him talk about. And I think he talked about it really well. And yeah, and we also sort of, said, we're going to be talking about 3 films before that conversation about all these women filmmakers by men, and I think it's that's when they're released, and but also, like you say, that the goal is that ultimately, I was going to say equality then, which I know is a completely loaded and problematic term, and I don't want to be flippant about it, but the sense that these are great films that are coming out, or interesting films that are coming out, and they happen to be made by men in this occasion, and then we're talking about women filmmakers in the main, and hoping that as our audience has kind of come with us this far, they'll keep going with us. I think it's important that we do that work sometimes, and maybe make errors, and maybe kind of raise questions and get responses from people about how we do things, rather than erring on the side of trying to play it safe with kind of trying to do the right thing. I think it's because I never want to get to the point where it's like we know how to deal with this, we know how to handle this kind of thing, because we don't. We're just doing our best.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that has come out of this for me, and this is in watching the film and going on the website, is this sense that that idea of the canon and what we go back to, whether it's on this podcast or whether it's in teaching, you are responsible for the shaping of that. We are, as people who teach in universities, we are responsible for that shaping. And whether it's if you're teaching directly on, say, a module about identity or women filmmakers, that's by the by. It's the idea that when you are showing a clip of great filmmaking, quote unquote, then the spectrum of that is so much broader than we and most people give it credit for, but also probably know. I mean, that's one of the things that this film does, is just open up the knowledge of filmmakers and films that, you know, it's just exciting to engage with, never mind anything else about politics.
Yeah, and also what it does is it kind of makes it so that there's no real excuse not to use this stuff now. It's absolutely constructed to be lifted out and used in teaching, you know, of any aspect of filmmaking that you could possibly imagine. Like you say, like there's an example for every type of kind of teaching, every kind of context that you might want, particularly in terms of practice. And that's how I was watching it, thinking, great, you know, like I don't have to do any work now. I don't have to get a clip. You know, not only do I not have to get a clip, I've got the clip, but I also got Mark Cousins explaining what's going on in the clip. Like it's absolutely ready-made to change a curriculum, which I think is really exciting. And I think that what's exciting now is that there's so many examples of that. You know, open source. There was a great kind of feminist film studies manifesto that was sort of did the rounds recently. Feminist film curriculum, which was the same thing. Was like, you know, you can no longer say, oh, I don't know where to find this stuff, or I don't know where, you know, like there's a website with every clip and every filmmaker listed for, you know, there's no excuse not to get on board and really kind of embrace this cinema, which just look, you know, like we sort of say in the thing, it looks and feels just like all the cinema you know and love already. It's not, it's nothing to be scared of.
And one of the things I wanted to talk to you about that kind of we touched upon in the interview, but we didn't get a chance, and it wasn't really, not that it wasn't appropriate, but it's kind of like, I don't want to sidetrack into this, but that idea that the way in which you look at something not from a position of knowing that identity, but actually from not being that identity can give you something, can give a sort of sense of it, something different. So like, say, for example, some of the great clips of, you know, male and male identity and sort of male relationships come from female filmmakers. In the film is a clip, and there's just this scene of it which is so, to me, absolutely perfectly encapsulates one of the fraught elements of father-son relationships, where the father and the son are sat in the car, and the father's a very successful surgeon and the son's a little bit of a, you know, a sort of dweeb, and it's a clear he's a disappointment to him, and the son sort of says in the car, you know, I really want to be like you're my hero, and the father says back to him, no, that's just not going to happen, is it? That's just not going to happen. And he doesn't even explain why. It's just like obvious, because you are just haven't got the talent of the father. And I think that there's a sort of sense in which a lot of sons feel like that about fathers. Do you know what I mean? And the fact that, you know, I have absolutely, you know, I would never sort of come to that and say, well, there's no way that a woman could understand or explain or explore or film that scene. Of course, because it's there, but it just captures the authenticity of that relationship so much. And I think it speaks to a little bit to the way Mark has sort of approached this film as a whole, as, he when he said in the interview, you know, we're a little bit too obsessed of writing what we know or talking about what we know. Actually, we should be making the effort to look or analyse or film or explore what we don't know.
Yeah, I think, you know, that definitely feels up for discussion, debate, tearing down at the moment. You know, it feels like we're in a time where that is very much on the agenda. Who gets to say what and who gets to tell what story? And I can understand it from a kind of a broad historical perspective, because I think that there is a history of that privilege being abused by white, you know, male screenwriters, directors, whatever. Yeah. But I find it really problematic, because, like you say, when you're saying you have to write from your own experience, it will limit the stories that women are able to tell. unless it's applied unilaterally. On the recent bonus episode we released with Hannah Woodhead, we talked about that, that part of the underlying anger is that what people don't want is white men to tell stories about white men anymore. So because we've seen enough or whatever. So it's like, well, if we say that you have to write from your own experience, but also we don't want to see these kind of stories, then it creates space for more voices and for different, but it limits those voices in terms of what they're able to do and the focus of their storytelling. And as Mark says in the, some women, Chantal Ackerman want to be seen as women feminist filmmakers.
Yeah.
And some don't. Some just want to be filmmakers who are allowed to make any kind of films. And you look at the films of Antonia Bird, his great friend, and that, she made a film about cannibals with Guy Pearce and Robert Carlyle, which is brilliant, But so what you're saying, but that's nowhere near her experience. I'm assuming she wasn't a cannibal, but I don't know. But I think that once you get into that conversation, it starts to come away, and it needs more nuance, and it needs more a more careful discussion, because it's so much of the great cinema that is out there that we love is the cinema of outsiders looking in, be that emigres in Hollywood in the 30s, 40s, kind of making these films about America as immigrants, be that transnational cinema, forced movement of people, engaging in countries, be that women making films about men, Catherine Bigelow's Point Break is a great example of a film that really understands male psyche and kind of bonding, and homoerotic kind of tensions and all that kind of stuff. It's, and that's what's great about this documentary is the sheer breadth is not only a kind of justification for writing outside your experience and making films outside your experience, but also like how to do that, and that kind of empathy and curiosity and respect is kind of are the key touchstones of how you do that well. And hopefully what that'll do is kind of raise the stakes and the standards of what people watch and engage with outside, and kind of what they expect to see from any filmmaker kind of making a film that's not directly about their own experience. It's a big question, and it's one that feels like it's being asked a lot at the moment. And I do completely empathise with the fact that there are so many representations that are lazy and disrespectful and not thoughtful at all. But it shouldn't stop the ability to do it, because when it's done well, it's like you say, it's kind of remarkable.
To be fair, when you're talking about the idea of the criticism of there's just white men, we don't want white male, or the criticism that there are too many white male stories out there, I think it's even to the point of sort of saying, well, I don't, you've got to nuance that even further. I think it's the same stories over and over again, and the same type of problematic masculinity that they produce, rather than just, I would hope so anyway. Because if you just say, even if it's white men who are the target of, rightly a lot of criticism, in terms of representation and broader cultural aspects, for sure. But if you just say, okay, that's it, stop talking, that, you know what I mean, that becomes slightly problematic. So I think it's a sort of hoping for an engagement with that history, but also going forward a change in that kind of representation, and obviously a kind of broader change in the film industry for equal opportunities in that sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think it's cultural. I just read a really great Audre Lorde collection that my wife bought me, and there's so many great things in there, but part of it is about education, and her kind of challenging people who said, I can't teach the writing of black women because I don't understand that experience, and then her kind of coming back and saying, but you'll teach Shakespeare and you'll teach Proust, what do you possibly, and it's just it's a conversation that is coming to film now in real terms, but is an ongoing conversation that needs to be had about how we engage with this stuff. And it is about nuance and about, well, what do you mean, and really opening people up to their own biases and their own ideas about, well, I can't possibly engage with that cinema because it doesn't teach me anything. It's like, well, You know, it's a very narrow way of looking at it, and ultimately it's to your detriment in terms of your experience, which is, you know, is sad really, because there's so much great stuff out there.
And you know, just getting back to the sort of crux of the film that Mark has made, and the kind of the way he's made it in terms of the focus of being the craft of filmmaking. I think it's amazing that there's so many, you know, so many examples of kind of non-Western filmmaking that is just, you know, you wish you had access to that. And I hope one of the things that happens on the back of this film is that there is more availability of these films in their entirety, because it would just be, I mean, there's some of the clips are just absolutely spellbinding, and you know, as we sort of talked about, that idea of reaching for the canonical filmmaker to make the comparison. But it's like, you know, the more we can see those films, the more you don't have to do that, and you just go to that source and say, oh, here's somebody who's making kind of surrealist filmmaking, or formalist, or really interrogating realism, or playing around with documentary, and you want to see those things happening, and sort of. And that would give more, that would hopefully push the argument further, that we don't, you know, that you don't separate off. There are women's films and there are men's films, and there are men filmmakers and women filmmakers, and they have particular kinds of aesthetic proclivities, let's say. Yeah,
absolutely. And it was encouraging when he sort of said that there'd already been moves based on this to introduce some of this stuff back into circulation in kind of good form, which is exciting.
Awesome. Great. Well done for setting that up. Thanks very much to everyone concerned, of course, to Mark and to the BFI, and really to everyone probably who participated in the film. I mean, God, what a great lineup of voices and films.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, kind of a treasure trove of great stuff, like you say, in terms of the narrators of the project and the clips and the films that are included. Yeah, well done to everyone involved. And you can see the film from Monday the 18th. It's available on Blu-ray, and the Blu-ray also includes a wonderful kind of 12-minute video essay on the making of the film, which is well worth checking out. And then also it's released in 5 parts over 5 weeks on the BFI Player from Monday the 18th as well. So broken down into a nice bite-size hour and a half, 2 hour chunks there, probably 2.5 hour chunks. And also, just as a note, there's another kind of group that we've done work with in the past, Reclaim the Frame and Bird's Eye View, are hosting an event next week with Mark talking about it. So if you've been following their amazing events with, they had Kitty Green from The Assistant, and they've got Eliza Hittman coming up. Mia Bays at Reclaim the Frame doing some amazing lockdown work. So check out Mark talking about the project there again next week if you want to. But yeah, thanks for setting it up, Jill at the BFI, and thanks Dario for doing it with me. It was great fun to do it.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. And that will do it for this episode. Neil, do you want to very quickly trail what's coming up on the next episode?
So the next episode is another collection, really. So it's The Uncertain Kingdom, which is a British short film project, and which is kind of released in its entirety on June the 1st. And at the start of all this kind of weird lockdown period, I spoke to some of the filmmakers behind some of those films. Some were commissioned and some applied for funding, and it's a project which looks at kind of Britain in 2019, 2020, and it's a really great collection of short documentaries, narratives, and other kind of experimental work. And so I've conducted some interviews with some of the filmmakers there, and we'll be sort of spending some time talking about short films on the next episode, which is another diversion for us as a podcast, which will be fun.
Great. If you want to get any more of our content in the meantime, we have just done a video bonus episode, which you can catch on our Patreon page. We've got a couple of new Patreon subscribers, actually. I just wanted to mention Brian Hutton and John Bleasdale. Thanks, guys, for paying to subscribe to our Patreon content. Just $2.50 a month for our monthly newsletters and bonus chat. But we did for better or worse, do a video chat where we talked about Portrait of a Lady on Fire and The Assistant and various other things.
Yeah, and it's spiked our subscription, so maybe video bonuses are the way to go.
Maybe they are in the future. But yeah, until next time, you can catch us on social networks, of course. Please get in touch if you've got anything to say about this episode or any of the previous ones. 100 would be happy to discuss them on social media or on the email, cinematologists@gmail.com. The Twitter is @cinematologists, and we're also on Facebook. We'll see you next time, Neil.
Yep, thanks again, buddy. That was great.
And thanks generally to our audience for their continued support. This has been the Cinematologist Podcast. Thanks for listening.
Tearing up holes in the house, they're tearing their paws in the ground. They're staring with blood.